You've seen how to create a controller, but we haven't seen how to associate that controller with a given view. So in this section, we're going to talk about the ng controller directive, and I'm going to show you an alternative syntax for actually defining and referencing controllers in your views. So up to this point, we've seen how we can write a function such as this simple controller, and the scope can be injected in automatically by AngularJS. From there, we can associate properties, functions, and other types of things in our controller. And then with a view, we can actually reference that scope and bind to it. But how does the view know about the controller? Well, it turns out there's actually a couple techniques you can do. One I'll show you here with ng controller. The other is through routing, which we'll cover later in the course. But for now, we can use the ng controller to simply reference the name of this function here. And then all the properties that are defined in the scope can be referenced. So in this case, we have data ng repeat, and we could say for each customers, like we've seen several times up to this point. So that's how easy it is to actually reference a controller using the ng controller directive. Now there is an alternative syntax for this though. This is what you'll see, I would argue, most of the time in the samples that are out there. But an alternative syntax when it comes to the actual definition highlighted here is to use the controller as syntax. Now this does change how you write the controller. So if you look at this function, you'll notice that there's no scope. We simply say this dot customers. Now this makes it where we don't have to have an injected scope, it just happens behind the scenes. AngularJS takes care of that. And what we can do with that now is use a controller as syntax in the ng controller directive. So as an example, up on this attribute here, we have ng controller, and instead of just saying the name of the controller, we can come in and say as, and then we could give it an alias. Now this is kind of like aliasing the scope, if you will, and it's useful in a few scenarios. First off, it's possible to have nested controllers. So maybe down here inside of this div, I could have another div with yet another controller. So this controller becomes the parent, and then the one within the div would be the nested one. Well, the benefit of doing this is now when I do control.customers, what I'm doing now is saying specifically where is that property coming from. It's very obvious. Now, when you don't use this syntax, sometimes it's a little bit hard if you have nested controllers to understand where a given property came from if you just look at the code itself. So this is just an alternative. I've actually learned using the other way the most, and that's what I use most of the time. But this is another alternative if you'd like, and it does clean up the controller a little bit in the sense that you don't have to have the scope injected. But on the other hand, it does require this dot instead of scope dot. So it really just depends on what you like to work with.